And it should be noted that proprietarianism does not in and of itself include call for violence. It is just a philosophy, but it just turns out that two of the proponents of this philosophy have been talking about undermining the system. And one of them is John Mark, the YouTuber. And you came out strong recently in a series of streams, and it seems to have really knocked some bells. It seems to have alarmed a lot of people. A lot of people are supporting you, of course. But I see, for example, that Kurt Doolittle has himself noted a comment on your stream, and he's extremely opposed to what you're saying. He says, I just lived through the Ukrainian revolution. 1,000 men used the cover of 100,000 civilians and overthrew a government with beer bottles, gasoline, tires, and rocks in a few weeks in front of my house. Oh my God, hand out leaflets, convince them. Yeah, all you shall preach to mankind the virtue of white well-being. There is, in his response, some things that are very surprising to me. All right. So it comes in parallel with the debate that had been occurring between Richard Spencer and All-Type, where All-Type says, Richard Spencer, your discourse about domination and about conquering territory and about aggressiveness at the level of controlling the state and using its tool for violence, it discredits the fight for white people to obtain respect in their society. Because if you adopt this might make right philosophy, you kind of acknowledge that if you lose the combat, you are bound to be a subordinate forever. So I find it interesting, and No White Guilt, take it and present to us what's happening here. What's your position on proprietarianism and on John Mark in particular?
Well, the first thing I'll say is I'll speak to what little bit of what Kurt Doolittle wrote under my video. I haven't seen that yet, but this notion that a bunch of guys with tires on fire overthrew a government is only for children and people who are otherwise limited in their capacities. That is absolutely not what takes place. The real holders of power behind the scenes pull the strings, and things are carried from the bottom to the top and forced from the top to the bottom by way of their will, by way of their strength behind the scenes. The people in the streets only feel. The guys setting tires on fire are the circus. And so the bottom line is, if you are made to believe, and I think this is the important thing, and this is where I was, I didn't know, and I don't want to speak specifically for Doolittle and his objectives, but anybody attempting to convince you, and certainly it sounds like this is the case with Doolittle now, anybody attempting to convince you that you can set some tires on fire and that you could blow up some infrastructure and you are going to be able to overthrow a country is trying to get you locked up in jail, because you are in prison for the rest of your life. And not only that, harm our movement for white well-being, for anything in the white positive sphere, because nothing could be further from the truth. You are not going to overturn a government by setting tires on fire, by blowing up a water plant, by blowing up a dam. That comes from an infantile notion of how much resource and how much loss the United States and other Western governments can suffer before they actually have come to a place where they are struggling. It's based in this Hollywood notion, and unfortunately, and I understand where this is coming from, where people have this idea of, after watching movies their whole lives, that this ragtag bunch can come together against some superpower and they overthrow it with a little act here or there. Folks, what he is suggesting is called terrorism. That's what he's suggesting. And if you commit an act of terrorism, you are going to go to prison. You will never see your family again. And not only that, but just to jump to later in my argument, and then I'll get to some of the notes I have here about this whole thing. Not only that, but if you commit an act of terrorism in the name of overthrowing the United States, representing something from the white positive sphere, you are going to bring down a hell on all of us that we can scarcely imagine today. I'm talking about wholesale roundups, because that is the sort of thing that the general public, the general scores of millions, and these are the people who matter, these are the people whose opinions that the regime has to manipulate, all of those people will find it acceptable to round us up if they begin to fear and if they can be made to believe the case that we are going to be responsible for acts of terrorism moving forward because some idiot went out and blew up 10 feet of railroad track. I mean, that's the sort of, so anybody telling you that sort of thing, and I'll jump to this also. I've been in the movement for a really long time. The movement for white well-being is what I refer to it, but the white positive sphere in general. And in the old days, we didn't have the internet. In the old days, all we had was face-to-face meetings. And in the old days, this government and perhaps outside governments endeavored constantly to insert workers of strife into our midst. And these people would come in, and they would watch, they would observe, and they would also make recommendations to commit violent acts. Well, sometimes the people at our meetings would say, or people attending these meetings would say, well, that's funny, and entertain that for a few moments, or maybe even say, well, that might work, and let's think about that. Not even get to the point of planning it. And then those people ended up in prison for the rest of their lives. Don't bother me with these questions of but entrapment, but this, but that. The anti-white regime magnifies the laws to catch us up in these nets, and you go away to jail every time. All of you people who are new to this cause, you need to hear these words of warning, because this is something that these are things that were axiomatic in the movement. And a reason why we really stymied the efforts of the feds over the years of doing this sort of thing, because these ideas, because these notions were axiomatic, that if anybody came in suggesting violence or illegality of any kind, they were almost assuredly federal agents, or state agents, or working for some other foreign entity. And we were able to stymie them. You need to know, if you're new to this movement, that there were people in this cause that would have the FBI show up at their house or some other branch of law enforcement, and they would go through their house and they would say, well, you have duct tape, you have bleach, you have a can of gasoline in the garage, you also have some nails in the garage, therefore you were planning to make bombs. And those people went to jail forever. And they were able to do that because they were able to take conversations that those people entertained, whether they were serious conversations, whether they were just foolish conversations, even if they were joking conversations. They were able to take those conversations and present them to grand juries and then to juries, and that was all it took to take these people and essentially make political prisoners out of them under some other pretext, considering some act of terrorism, making bombs or what have you, and put them away for life. Our prisons are full of these people through the 70s, through the 80s. Look at folks, not only by way of these laws, the government's doing these things, but look at the lawfare. Look at what happened to people like Tom Metzger, who didn't actually tell people, and these Christian identity people, who didn't actually say, go out and murder some X, Y, or Z because that would be good for us, or that's what they deserve. They didn't actually say that. They just said that the outcome of such an act would be acceptable. It might be positive. It might turn back the tide that's against us. And what ended up happening? Lawsuits were filed against them. They were found to be guilty and collaborating, essentially, instigating these things by creating this atmosphere of positive outcomes by way of violence. And now 2/3 of his pay, 2/3 of his income, 2/3 of these people are garnished for the rest of their lives to pay for the family members of these deceased people that ended up getting killed. That is what will happen to us if we allow this kind of rhetoric to take place. That is what will happen to you. And I care about you out there. If you genuinely care about white well-being and you want to do something positive for our people, I care about you. I care about your family members. I care about you being robbed from their lives because you entertained some idiotic notion about committing some act of sabotage because you allowed some liar to trick you into believing that you could overthrow the United States with sabotage. I care about those family members who will be left behind without you. I care about you who will have to join some neo-Nazi group in prison just so you won't be murdered for being white in jail. And I care about our cause that will be persecuted, and the persecution will be acceptable to the broad mass of the population of white people, the ones who matter, the ones who have to be propagandized by the regime, because they will be able to be convinced at that point that we mean to blow up their water plants and they won't get fresh water. We mean to blow up their electricity, and their monitors on their nearly deceased mother or father won't work anymore, or the lights won't work, and then their child will get into a car accident and die. That is the kind of tide that you will bring against us with such acts. There is no counter entity. And that's the thing for there to be such a civil war. But I'll back up. I don't know if JF wants something to say, but
I'd like to mention something. So I don't fully disagree with what you're saying there. It's very pragmatic to be telling the base, look, you're not going to change the United States by taking your gun and doing something on the highway. It's not going to work. And in fact, even if you are coordinated with 100 people, it's not going to work. But there's a difference. First, let's establish what is John Mark saying. So as far as his stated position, John Mark says, I advocate for peaceful separation of right-wingers. And he says, however, peaceful separation is unlikely to happen. Civil war is a very likely outcome for the current state of America. So we need to divide here. Are you accusing him of dog whistling that civil war is desirable, or are you criticizing his stated belief?
I am criticizing that. Well, first of all, let me just say about John Mark. He seems like a great guy. He's amiable. He was just on Tutar. We had a great conversation there. We've had some private back and forth as well. Seems like a great guy. Nothing against him personally. We're men. We can have a disagreement about how to arrive at Z and not have a cat fight as a result of it. And that's how I see it. So I disagree with this analysis that a civil war is even possible, because to have a civil war, you need another entity. You need an oppositional entity. I mean, like, for example, you just mentioned there, 100 or whatever, so many guys all working together. The moment that the idea leaves your head to communicate it to someone else, unless you are in a quiet room, unless you therefore don't have your phone present, and unless all of these other things are present, the United States is going to know what you're planning. None of this stuff goes on. You're not going to be able to talk over WhatsApp or whatever and have them not listen in. That is a foolish thing to think, that the government doesn't know what you're planning. And not only will they know what you're planning, but they'll be able to move against you. And perhaps they'll be able to help you along, as certain false flag operations in the past have been said to be brought about, to help bring you to that place where that attack could take place, and therefore, in our case, harm our movement. So I don't believe, A, that a civil war is possible, because there isn't an oppositional entity. You need a government for people to pledge allegiance to. You need a church, you need a religion, you need an ideology, you need a something, you need a colors for people to rally around, a center for people to orbit, a gravitational center. And then that gravitational center has to be able to disseminate its information to its members, to its allegiant members, to its acolytes. Because if it can't, who speaks to them? Who speaks to that population out there but the anti-white regime? So the moment that, say, an individual wants to go carry out an act of sabotage or what have you, the moment that happens, first of all, it's going to have to be lone wolf type of operation, because no group of people are going to be able to get together and resist the United States without the United States knowing what's happening. And then you have Ruby Ridge, and then you have Waco, and then you have the government of the United States and law enforcement of the United States able to accelerate all the way to murdering you, women and children and all the rest. And they've done it before, and they'll do it again. So not only is that not going to happen, but what you have is somebody who goes out, or maybe two guys go out, they never talk in the presence of their phone. Somehow they're able to slip through the cracks, and the federal government doesn't figure out or doesn't help them along to commit their act of terrorism. And then once the act of terrorism is committed, once the dam is blown up, once the bridge is blown up, the single bridge or what have you, because there won't be able to be a concerted effort by the millions and millions. Once that happens, it'll be the anti-white regime that speaks to the population.
So
Perfect.
you are making then a statement of factual impossibility, not
Right.
just of moral issues where, okay, maybe pragmatically it's not good to talk about the civil war, but you're making the case that civil war will not happen. On this, I would challenge. I mean, the circumstances can change extremely quick for the U.S. I can imagine stuff like a nuclear war. I can imagine conflicts involving Russia, China, Israel, and I can imagine the situation for the US changing from being a world power to being reduced to being unable to even police its own territories. And in these circumstances, a movement like the Yellow Vest in France may not be so far from reverting the state of power in the US.
I don't think that, well, first of all, a speculation about something as unlikely as nuclear war and a context shift because of nuclear war. I mean, let's deal with the context that we have. Let's deal with the context that is most likely to be the context in the immediate future. I mean, if we resort to, I mean, I agree with you, JF. If we have a radical shift in context, if aliens show up tomorrow, if a spaceship shows up tomorrow and then people realize, well, we're not the only intelligent beings in the world, or in the universe rather, and God isn't real or something like that, they start saying, and then there's wholesale anarchy, then yes, there might be a breakdown in the military, but we haven't seen a real revolution in a very long time. All of these revolutions that are taking place and have taken place around the world are being orchestrated from behind the scenes. They have massive amounts of money behind them that are operating these things. They have a massive amount of communication and networks that are at work. The notion that these things are taking place by a bunch of plucky rebels in some bunker somewhere is pure Hollywood. And it is the kind of people who are wrapped up in such things are the same kind of people who are wrapped up in these sorts of movies where the Hollywood physics rule the day, and somehow that becomes the reality of our actual world, where little girls think that they can beat up 10 grown men because it's happened in Hollywood. I mean, this is preposterous. So there, given our context, given the expected context, given that, and if we don't have nuclear war, and I'm not, even if we have nuclear war, I mean, you're still going to have these systems in place that these anti-white elites operate, and they're not going to just give them up, folks. They're going to kill everyone they have to maintain control. You still need an oppositional entity. You still need a superstructure that you can pledge your allegiance to, a wealth structure, a power structure, and there isn't one. Since there isn't an oppositional entity, you have individuals who are fighting then against these anti-white elites, fighting against the law enforcement of the United States, fighting against the military of the United States, and there isn't a snowball's chance. And these notions, well, that you'll disrupt by way of XYZ in this town or that town or something, the government would just pull up around that town and they would turn off the electricity, they would turn off the water, no one would be allowed to come or go, and they would just say, when the troublemaker is found, we'll turn everything back on. How quick would the population submit to that? No food, no water, they get thirsty pretty fast.